When I hear about service dogs and guide dogs in this case, I guess you just kind of know when you know. Graham, is this...
No. I'm sorry. I said no because I think a lot of the book is about denial.
And we went out to do like a longer workout, but it was a very, very, very cold day. And I think Deni's response was something like, "Are you trying to kill me?"
I never accused you of trying to kill me. I did accuse you of trying to put me in really stressful circumstances to see how I would respond with a guide dog when I was really stressed out.
Yeah.
I think I did use the term torture.
Welcome to This Pause For You podcast, celebrating service, therapy, and working dogs, and how they save lives every day. Join us as we get to know the dogs and their handlers. Be sure you're subscribed. This Pause For You podcast is brought to you in part by Springer Education Entertainment, Anchor Productions, and Dogs on Duty, the Dog-U Series. Find out more about that one at thedoguseries.com. Now your host, refreshing Rahn Springer.
Thanks for joining us. Today we're joined by two powerhouses in the guide dog world. Deni Elliott, a vision-impaired handler, ethics professor, and lifelong explorer of what independence really means. And Graham Buck, a veteran guide dog trainer with more than 3 decades of guiding eyes for the blind, and now the founder of Buck's Best Dogs. Together, they co-authored the remarkable new book, Catching Sight: How a Guide Dog Helped Me See Myself. A story that blends humor, heartbreak, and hard-earned wisdom from both sides of the harness. It's a rare look at the guide dog partnership told by the person who lived it and the trainer who shaped it. Deni, Graham, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Deni, before any guide dog entered your life, you navigated the world more like a sighted person than someone with a visual impairment. How did you manage that for so long, and what did it cost you internally?
That's a great question, but I think like most people with progressive vision loss, I started off with low vision. I didn't know that my vision was different from anybody else's for quite a while. And over time, it just got worse and worse. And I adjusted how I could. I adapted how I could. And then finally, I couldn't navigate without a white cane, and then without a guide dog.
When I hear about service dogs and guide dogs in this case, I guess you just kind of know when you know. Graham, is this...
No. I'm sorry. I said no because I think a lot of the book is about denial, I was raised by parents who had the best intentions in terms of helping me think that my visual difference was not a big deal and that I should capitalize on my strengths instead of focusing on my limitations. So that's all good news. The problem is that I learned to hide my disability as much as possible, and to the extent that I think I made some really bad ethical choices, and I admit that as an ethics professor.
So now you have to tell me more, because the book has different levels of interaction, humor, and challenges, and this is one that is intriguing because you're living your life as independent as possible, and you were determined to keep that and until you realized that maybe you needed some help with a cane or a dog. And so how did that come about with conflict between way you were living or presenting or coming across and ethics in as you taught? How did you deal with that conflict?
A couple of things. First of all, I have to say that my belief as I was growing up and going through graduate school and becoming an assistant professor and getting started in a life of academe is that if people knew I had a disability, they wouldn't judge me by my work. And so I was affected by the discrimination that I think people with disabilities have. And I thought, and I think wrongly now, but I thought at the time that my success depended on people not being aware of my challenges. I've considered those private problems. But how it played out in terms of ethics is, in some ways, I think it made me a better ethics professor because I started each semester with every class of students saying we all make moral mistakes. It's the human condition. Learning to make good decisions, learning to affect the world and other people and other species in the best way possible. It's lifelong learning. And we make mistakes. With any luck, we can admit them, learn from them, and move forward.
Wonderful. Let's get back to your childhood, and let's talk about Marty. So Marty was such a important member of the family that when he passed, you told a nun that your big brother had passed. And so here's the question. How did that early bond shape your way you relate to dogs now? What happened there?
I think in retrospect, as I was growing up, I thought of my relationship with Marty, my big black Newfoundland big brother, Marty, as, you know, a unicorn. I mean, he was unique. He understood me and my visual needs in ways that I don't think the people around me did. And so he'd let me hold on to him and would help me get places in a way that was far easier than my trying to navigate on my own. And it wasn't until I heard the words legally blind for the first time when I was in my 30s that it occurred to me that maybe a dog trained to do the kinds of things that Marty just did out of his understanding and big heart might help me get around the world better than with a white cane.
Awesome. Dogs are just so incredible. So Graham, so from a trainer's perspective, then there's a deep connection at the family level, a bond that happens with a working dog, and a difference between a pet. How does that happen?
So, yeah, I mean, you're talking about, ultimately, an animal, a dog that's going to be basically glued to this person pretty much 24/7. So they're going to become this like integral part of each other. The dog's also going to become part of the person's identity. The pet dogs can do some of the similar things and often do, but the difference is that the pet dog isn't needed necessarily to that capacity as like a guide dog is or some service dogs are. So now you're talking about a dog that they is forming a strong dependence, almost a codependence with that person. And whatever happens to the dog happens to the person and vice versa. So they form something that's almost like it's just bigger. You're taking it to a whole nother level because they're basing it also primarily on need, versus want. And, in the pet dog community, people want what they want. They want a Great Dane. They want a German Shepherd. They want this dog for whatever reason, but it's not the same as needing the dog.
Along those lines, then how do you know when someone's ready to be responsible for a guide dog? Is it something that's instinctual? Is it teachable readiness, or is it something in between?
Yeah, I think probably all of those things. I mean, obviously, there's a process the person, as Deni herself went through, going through the admissions process, going through all that paperwork, having a home interview, all of those things working up until that point of actually like making the decision to train with a dog and have a dog be part of your life. I think that's the hardest part is when is that person truly ready for that and able to do that? And sometimes it's easy because they've had prior dogs before, then they're already like in that mindset, or it could be the first time they've never had that experience. And that's where the trainer really is guiding that individual through the process of, okay, this is what success looks like. This is how we get there, because you're basically like taking a piece of clay and trying to form it into something, both with the dog and the person. It's not always easy because although like the protocols and the techniques and the training and everything's there, trying to convince a person that this dog literally can help them, requires something more than just science. And so the trainer plays that really critical role in almost being a facilitator, a mentor, that type of thing. So I'll give you just one fast example. So for a brand new student, a young woman had in her head, she never had a dog before, but she had in her head that she would to be with a female dog, a female lab. And we had chosen a male lab for her because it was a better fit. And so when she found out she got the mail, she cried and cried and cried and said, yeah, there's no way. I can't attach myself to a male dog. I can't do it. And I was basically like, okay, let's give it like 3 to 5 days. And after 3 to 5 days, if you still feel that way, we'll switch. So the time went by and I went to her and said, whatever her name was, Mary, okay, we're at that point, how are you feeling? And her words were, you're not taking this dog from me. So there was the answer, and that happened a lot.
They just work their way into your hearts. What happens?
Yeah, I think, and as Deni described so well in the book, she came from a lot of different experiences with dogs before she even got to the guide dog school. And I think that, that part of the process requires somebody's ability to kind of coach the person and help the person believe that this is actually something that is workable and can help them. But we don't always know that in the beginning.
Certainly.
I'd like to just say something about Graham as an instructor, though, because I agree with him that, you have to learn to trust a dog with your life.
Yes.
Which is, I think, a very big difference between guide dogs and a lot of other legitimate service dogs. But Graham, I think, is just a terrific teacher. And as a college professor, I really appreciated his ability to figure out ways around all of my denials and obstacles and all the stuff I built up to protect myself, so that I could actually become vulnerable to Alberta, to this guide dog. And I'm sure I tested his patience more than once, but he had a big arsenal to choose from, I think, in terms of dealing with, with people who are having trouble adjusting to a guide dog.
Certainly. So, Graham, you have any favorite stories about Alberta and Deni?
Well, there's several, but one that stands out, and Deni's going to know this one right off the bat. Remember, Deni was living in Florida, and she came up you were up in January, right, I think?
No, it was March, actually. It just felt like January in the Arctic.
Yeah, it was cold. It's the Hudson Valley, so it's very cold in March. And we went out to do like a longer workout, but it was a very, very, very cold day. And I think Deni's response was something like, "Are you trying to kill me?" or something like that. So, coming from Florida, but, it's, you have to get out, you have to work, you have to you can't be sitting, around all day if you want to actually learn and get accustomed to the dog and get comfortable and all of that. So that's one of them. I think the other one where Deni touched on being able to adapt. Right away, I knew that Deni was going to be a person that wanted to be ahead of the curve. She wanted to get to the front of the class. She wanted to be doing more coming from her academic background. So right away, we were in the early stages of training, and normally we do relatively quieter environments. But this particular day, there was a St. Patrick's Day parade in White Plains.
I remember that in the book. This is good.
Yeah. So Deni said, well, why can't we just work through the parade, because this is what I'm going to be doing. And I want to be able to see what, Alberta can do. But it was only day 3. And so they were relatively new. So we talked it out and we reached a compromise. And basically I said, okay, we're going to do it. But if at any point, I see something where I feel like Alberta's getting stressed or she's not ready, we're going to take a turn down the side street, quiet side street. So Deni and I kind of talked it out, and she agreed to that and I agreed to that. And the rest is kind of, Alberta was fine. Deni was fine. There was no issue to go down a side street. But it was great for me, because then also that kind of opened the door up for me to understand Deni a little bit more and how she learned and what was important to her in the learning process, and how could I make that happen versus just kind of saying, well, this is day 3 and this is what we do and I'm not budging, that type
And
of.
I would actually like to say, I never accused you of trying to kill me. I did accuse you of trying to put me in really stressful circumstances to see how I would respond with a guide dog when I was really stressed out.
Yeah.
I think I did use the term torture.
Yeah, something like that. It was definitely something like that, and I think that, um, yeah, so those were two memorable ones for sure.
So, Denny, along the line of the dogs you've worked with, you had 4 actual service dogs, 2 self-trained, and then 2 professionally trained. So they're very different dogs. So are there things that each one taught you that others couldn't?
Yes. And I like to actually make a bigger distinction between pets and what I would call task-trained guide dogs, my 2 privately trained guide dogs, and professionally trained dogs that get the big picture. They understand that they're functioning as the eyes at the end of the harness.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's understandable that people want to take their pets into public spaces. 97% of U.S. families who have pet dogs consider the family dog a family member, and they want the dog with them. Completely understandable. But when they take the pet into no pet zones where only legitimate service dogs are allowed, and the pet dog misbehaves, they put the service dog team in danger. Alberta and I had an attack at an airport by an inappropriate dog. And they also reduce the credibility of those of us with legitimate service dogs. In the last 7 days, I've had 3 ride denials from Lyft drivers. I'm experiencing more difficulty with people understanding that I'm legally blind. This is my guide dog who helps me get around. I answer all the appropriate questions. But there are so many dogs that just don't belong in public spaces. They shouldn't be there. So now when I started off with my dog, again, I've said I've never jumped into a swimming pool. I always sort of wade into things. And I certainly waded into guide dogs. I had a 6-month-old golden retriever puppy who I bought for agility competition. I did agility competition and rally. And so I was big into dog sports for a long time. But it wasn't until I got the puppy who I'd waited for well over a year to realize that I no longer had the vision necessary to do agility. And so that puppy, Oriel, was about 6 months old when I first was told by a doc that I was legally blind. And I had a conversation with the puppy. I said, "So what would you think about becoming my guide dog?" And I happened to know a trainer who worked with dogs for people with mobility disabilities who had had guide dog experience. And that trainer, who is called Travis in the book, he basically evaluated Oriel and said, I think this would work. So Oriel was task trained. She learned to stop at elevation changes. She learned to steer me around obstacles. She could get me past rolling suitcases in airports. However, she might grab a pretzel out of a kid's hand as we passed. She had some fatal flaws in terms of guide dog work. I'll give you that. But it wasn't until I met Alberta who kept saying, "Deni, I got this. I know what I'm doing here. Trust me." She didn't really say that, but her body language said that.
Certainly.
And she taught me that I could trust her to have the overall picture. But I think that having multiple guide dogs over one's lifetime, I'm actually now on guide dog number 3 from Guiding Eyes, Hildy, who is a black lab closely related to Alberta. They share some really interesting characteristics. But I think you have to be a serial monogamist. The point is that every dog is different. Every dog has her own personality or his own personality. They have their own way of connecting with you. And you've got to basically be open and love the one you're with.
Awesome. So, Graham, you think that is it part of the breeding, like Hildy and Alberta are connected, or is it some of that learned behavior on the dog's part?
So it's definitely a combination of both. So it's intentional breeding, you know, over decades of creating this sort of universal guide dog. Now, for example, the Labrador is a universal breed worldwide, like surpassed the German Shepherd. It's literally worldwide utilized as a guide dog. So you're heading towards a certain type of dog. They have a certain look, a certain, you know, carriage, temperament. Like I can identify a guiding eyes dog anywhere I go. I knew exactly what they look like. I know immediately if it's a guiding eyes dog or not. Also how they were trained as well. But then the dogs also they learn, like the training is a blueprint for them, so they learn within that blueprint, and the way that they are trained forms a new sort of mental mapping in them themselves. So they have kind of like they're working when a harness is on, they're in a zone, they're working in a zone, and like we call it a zone and a mode, and then they're in a mode of reaching a destination or a goal or something like that. But the guide work itself creates its own bubble, like within a bubble. So it's a combination of their breeding is heading the dog in a certain direction, just like people that do say like hunting and, you know, working with like, you know, retrievers for ducks and all that kind of stuff. That's a very different looking and acting Labrador compared to what you would see in guide work. But that part of their brain going to that sort of zone and mode is the critical piece, because when they're in that capacity, they're thinking differently than perhaps like a pet dog would be.
And I also would like to say that the guide dogs know when they are in and around guide dog schools. I was on graduate council at Guiding Eyes for the Blind, and I was always impressed with when we got to school, Alberta, you know, we were on perfect behavior, both of us. And I noticed with my successor dogs that when a home trainer came around, my Guiding Eyes guide dog acted differently around the Guiding Eyes staff member trainer than, you know, students or friends or people we pass on the street. They know when they're being watched.
Yeah, yeah. It's so speaking of Alberta then again, you mentioned that because she had it, she was communicating to you that I got this, don't worry. Was that something that came just gradually, or was it like the point where you had the snake that she stopped? Was it really clear at that point, before that point, or at that point?
I would say that my first epiphany with Alberta was the first time I was working with her on harness on the nature path at Guiding Eyes for the Blind.
So
And
early on, yeah,
Graham was right there behind
yeah,
us,
yeah.
interpreting what Alberta was trying to tell me. And I began to learn to read her cues. I became more and more impressed with her decisions, whether to move around an obstacle toward the right or toward the left. Her ability to point her nose to where I should push to open a door. These are all cognitive abilities that dogs have that I don't think they get credit for.
So they really problem solve, don't they, Graham? In any
Yeah,
situation, right?
it's a huge part of it. And you have to also think of it again, like, so there's this sort of blueprint and, you know, and the dogs are all learning the same skills, but they're an intelligent, social, emotional animal, and they're all going to walk away with a slightly different picture of what the training is. And they're also going to have their own style. They're going to have their own work ethic. They're going to have their own way of doing things. And, you know, sometimes we would refer to them as like a Cadillac. We would sometimes call the German Shepherds a Cadillac. They feel like a Cadillac. And then the Labs feel like an SUV or something like
Mm-hmm.
that when working. But, you know, because they have a brain and they are taking in the training in their own way. And then when it comes back out with their new handler, that's also like taking on, you know, another component. And I think in Deni's case, she was probably used to doing even more for the dog, you know, maybe helping the dog even unintentionally more with the guide work. And I think that was the part when she came to Guiding Eyes and she now started to work with Alberta, that whole thing of like, she's got this, of being able to kind of communicate with the dog, but allow the dog to do its job, which can be difficult for people that aren't used to that or are used to being in total control. Many times when a blind person first works with a guide dog, a gentleman once described it as being shot out of a cannon. He had worked with a cane all along, and all of a sudden he was like flying down the street. Because that's also another thing that a lot of sighted people don't understand, is that many blind people walk very fast. Not all blind, guide dog handlers walk slow. Some do, just like anybody else. But there are many people that walk briskly, and they're often like, well, how can they do that? Well, they can. And the dog is trained to walk that way as well.
So another thing that I know people, they're amazed about is intelligent disobedience. So that is, I guess, the key, that the dog has to be able to step up and do that. So how do you teach the dog to override the command in order to protect the handler? What is there is it just a slow process, or is the dog just at some point say or understand that I got to stop at the curb here or turn right and not left?
It's a conditioning process, but it basically is utilizing the animal sense of sort of like welfare, and they also soon realize that they're connected to a person by a harness. So again, if something happens to them, it happens to the person, and vice versa. So for example, at some point they'll be forced into an unsafe situation and then shown that, using their natural ability not to want to be in it, for example, coming upon a platform edge at a train station, and maybe the handler thinks they're facing another direction, but they're not. And now they're forcing the dog to go forward, telling the dog to go forward multiple times. Like, okay, why aren't you going forward? Why aren't you going up these steps? And the dog's like, no, we can't go here. So the dog gives the person kind of like a red light and says like, no, we can't go. And if the person keeps pushing, the dog will back up and back out of the situation. So that is both a conditioned response, but also just like, they don't want to die. So, so they'll utilize that. And it's something very unique with guide dogs. And so you need a dog that has some level of, wherewithal about it, and has that presence of mind to be able to override the handler when the handler is wrong. And that takes a dog that has some level of fortitude.
Deni, any thoughts?
I think that as a philosopher, I like puzzles. And one of my favorite things about working with my guide dog is trying to understand what she's trying to tell me. Graham is a wonderful translator and interpreter, and I think that goes with being a tremendous guide dog instructor. You have to be able to help the person and the dog communicate. It's a whole new language. And it's a whole new language with a different kind of being. I think that if there's a mistake that I think a lot of humans make, it's projecting their humanness onto the dog, or not understanding that the dog sees a completely different world than we do because of their incredible sensory abilities that we can't even imagine. But so when I ask Hildy, in this case, my current guide dog, to do something, and she doesn't. Okay, if she's off harness, off duty, she might just be, being ornery, it happens. But when she's on harness, she and I both know that ultimately she's in charge. And so if she chooses a route, like say getting from home to the office, that's different from what we usually do. I try to be aware, try to think about what might be going on. And if I'm aware of passing somebody on the street, I'll say, my dog kind of chose a different route here. Can you tell me what's going on? Oh, yeah, there's a scaffolding there. They're washing the windows. Or there's a truck that's backed up and, they're unloading books into the bookstore. But there's something. I may not always know what it is, but I trust my dog. And I think that's why our relationship is so good.
I wanted to touch on, a couple of things. One is how, you connected so well with Alberta, and then you don't expect her to have her own vision problems. And so how did you deal with, there's an irony and then there's grief to deal with. How did you do that?
Oh, I was devastated. And actually from Graham's response when he met us, when we came back to Guiding Eyes for Alberta to have the surgery that would remove her eye and force her into retirement when she was only 5 years old. I think he was devastated as well.
I'm not surprised. All of the book is well written, but the way you related that, it was, and it's, it's very sad, but she's was very dedicated, and as I recall from the book, she went on to live with your nephew, correct, and his family?
One of the bad decisions I made after Alberta had her, I removed and went to live with my nephew and his wife, who were then living on a big piece of property I owned in Montana. I saw her 8 weeks after surgery, and I was there trying to help her cope with our new relationship in the family. And she threw a fit when she couldn't get in the car to go back to the airport with me. And I caused her pain that I didn't need to cause her at that point. But I didn't know how hard it would be for her to not be in my life the way she had been.
Another follow-up to that, Graham, do you see that often when you have the service dog has an issue? I know that the way they're selected and they're bred and they're breeding in a way that eliminates a lot of problems, but this was out of the blue, as I recall, with Alberta. And so how do you support the handlers with their loss? What is it that you found works?
Yeah, it's a very one of the most difficult things about the work itself, because there are things that, unfortunately like this that happen. And, there are very few things in life, from my experience between people, especially people that are very accomplished and sort of guarded and, are in a lot of control in their life. The only thing that I've ever seen that bring people to their knees is something like this with a dog, or if the dog, retires or passes away, or something out of the blue happens health-wise, even cancer. I mean, you will see like grown men cry on the floor and grown women. And so, I've walked through countless times with people going through that experience. And it's probably the one time that I saw Deni at a loss. I saw that she was struggling tremendously. All she can do is be there for the person, and try to help them move through it, and allow them to grieve, and allow them to go through the process. And sometimes people would call me, and I would just be holding the phone, and they would just be crying for like 10 minutes. And then we would like recount a funny story from training, or something about that, because I knew all the dogs forwards and backwards. I knew their personalities, and I knew them from training. So we would go back to that and try to find something joyful, or, comedic, or whatever. But I think guide dogs it's a fragile existence, because I wish they could go on for like 30 years and work, but they don't live that long.
Just before we end, I'd like to leave you with a question I have that might be of interest to your listeners and viewers as well. It's something that I'm just really coming to terms with at this point after all of these dogs and all of these years. The fact that we trust guide dogs with our lives, does that mean that the dogs themselves have moral responsibilities? And I ask that, it's a place where the questions that are predominant in my personal life intersect with my professional life. What does it mean for somebody to have a moral responsibility to take care of another, for example? And can we give that level of responsibility to dogs? And if the answer is, of course not, then just what is this relationship with guide dogs?
Well, maybe we can get some responses in the comments. That'll be interesting. Where can people find the book?
June 16th, if all goes well, people will be able to find the print edition, the large print edition, the audiobook, and the Braille version, all at the same time. That's what I'm working on.
Graham, anything else for you?
I would just probably leave it at, if somebody sees a working team out there, just be respectful and give them space, and allow them to do their thing.
Very good point. Thank you, Deni. Thank you, Graham. And to the listeners of this Pause Review podcast, we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening and for subscribing to this Pause for You podcast. Visit our website, tpfypod.com. We are currently accepting submissions for additional sponsors so they can pay me with more than just dog biscuits. That could be you. This is Epic Voice Guy John Bailey saying, until next time, ruff, ruff, bow, wow, sniff, sniff.